Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is your host, Kushalmehra. All right, my guest today is Dr. Makarand Paranjape, and we are here to talk about his book, JNU, Nationalism and India's Uncivil War. Welcome, Dr. Paranjape.
Thank you, Kushalji. It's wonderful to be on your show again. Probably, I think it's for the third time, yes.
Yes, for the third time. So, Dr. Paranjape, I actually wanted to start with this. I was fascinated by the title of the book itself. So you've used some interesting words here: nationalism and India's uncivil war. Now, why did you use the word uncivil war? So let's break down the uncivility itself first.
Exactly. Well, it's a pun, as it were, or a play on words, because a civil war is normally an armed conflict, the kind that the United States went through. You might say our partition was like a civil war, though it was an undeclared war. So, what I meant by an uncivil war is a war which is, if not as bloody, certainly, I mean, in other words, not involving as much bloodshed, it's certainly extremely violent, in terms of the rhetoric. So I see that what we experience in India over the last maybe a decade or so, or a little less, is nothing short of an uncivil war. It's a culture war, and we need not feel, you know, exceptionally concerned or guilty, because the world over, free societies are going through this churn, tremendous churn. And it comes with certain attendant features, which I have tried to outline in the book. And one of these is, of course, illiberal liberalism. That is the twilight of liberalism, the decline of liberalism. And now Francis Fukuyama also has a book on it. So, this kind of illiberal liberalism, cancel culture, wokeism, and polarization of society, uh, the hollowing out of the middle ground of rational and civilized dialogue and debate and dissent, which are, in my view, at the heart of democracy. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I do believe that there are authoritarian trends and tendencies within free societies where people are beginning to think, you know what, it's good to have a very strong leadership. Everyone lines up behind a strong leader, and the difference between civil society and government reduces. So you have the same ideology permeating both sectors. So these are dangerous things, but it's happening all over the world. And yet, why in India I think it's a little different is that it's also the time of, you might say, the unfinished Indian Renaissance, which required certain conditions, which required the debunking of certain, state or statist ideologies. So that's my book is plugging right into this conflict, taking JNU as the site of symbolic, you might say it symbolizes the debates at the national level, because JNU was a left bastion, as you know, but yet the debates that took place here, the fight over JNU, is in some ways the fight over India. That's what I've tried to show in the book.
So now in your book, you have a very specific concept that you talk about, and I think we have to spend some time on that. So you start, if I remember correctly, it is on it's in the prologue itself. You talk about intermedial hermeneutics, and later on you also talk about diatopical hermeneutics. Now these are highly technical terminologies, Dr. Paranjape, and maybe the average reader, when they read the book, they may find it hard to understand. So my request to you will be, let us spend some time, and if you could break down these concepts and explain them through simplistic analogies. When you're talking about intermediate hermeneutics, what exactly are we talking about here?
Exactly. Well, intermediate hermeneutics, I would like to take credit for coining this phrase, but essentially it's a way of reading or interpreting, because that's what hermeneutics means, not just texts, not just books, not just documents or pamphlets or even the constitution of a country or the poll agenda of a party before an election, but a way of interpreting society. Because let's face it, we are all trying to engage and intervene and possibly transform the societies where we live. Now, the point I've been trying to make is illustrated in an article which came out just this morning in the New Indian Express, where my argument is what happens when you want to end the politics of appeasement? Because we know what the politics of appeasement does. It divides society, it pits citizens against each other, and it creates a minoritarianism which is really unhealthy. Now, what happens is sometimes the pendulum swings to the other side, and is the alternative to appeasement domination, where one community, say the majority community, dominates the minority, demonizes it, and constantly accuses it of bad faith, if not, betrayal, if not of treason. That is where intermediate hermeneutics comes in. That usually the corrective is an overcorrective, and you go to the other extreme, which is also terribly harmful. That's why I said illiberal liberalism means that you start with freedom of expression and then you clamp down on everything. So again, the pendulum swings. And in the uncivil wars that we are going through, there's a dire need for intermediate hermeneutics, which is not necessarily some kind of middle path, which is very mechanistically or mechanically negotiated. Not at all. In each instance, there'll be a difference of how you work it out. But fundamentally, the theoretical assumption is that the polarities do not represent the reality. They do not represent what's actually happening in society. And one of the factors I didn't mention, but it's obvious that wherever we see this crisis, social media is a part of it. The shrill rhetoric, if not worse, you can call it trolling, you can call it these anonymous handles which are bots, but this extremely divisive and polarizing rhetoric that social media unleashes as a form of mind control and influence. The populace is being influenced and divided. So these are the features of the uncivil wars that we see. We can outline many more, but it also results in social inequalities, especially exacerbated by things like COVID, where you have an underclass of underemployed or unemployed youth. We saw the protests over Agniveer, the scheme, even if you might say these were politically motivated. You see the anguish, the angst, the anxiety, the insecurity that the young who are not very well qualified or who don't have the special skill set to survive, who are not anti-fragile, the anxiety, the insecurity, the anger that they feel. Again, this is endemic to free societies the world over. So these are some of the features, and intermediate hermeneutics is required so that you can get more, I would say, engaged and accurate understanding of what's happening in these societies. And eventually, if you do it right, intermediality will also be remedial. It will also heal the fissures. It will also try to bring these opposites together. It's not to reconcile opposites, but at least to have them in a meaningful dialogue. And this is where the other phrase that you mentioned, diatopical hermeneutics, comes in, because in a way I derive intermediality from this diatopical hermeneutics and its genealogy. It's interesting. It actually goes to an Indian, amazingly erudite person called Raimondo Panikkar, a theologian, originally from Kerala. His father was Keralite, his mother was Spanish, and he settled in Spain, and he was as I said, he did a Veda Manjari, He was a Catholic, but then the church was very unhappy with him. We won't go into the details, but he uses it the first time. But the person that tried to apply it to various domains in the social studies sector was a man called Bonventura de Souza Santos. He's not known in India. He's a Portuguese, human rights and social science, academic. But his basic thesis is this: that to have a dialogue, both sides must admit the incompleteness of their positions. And that's why you can have a diatopical, meaning two topoi, two topos. You occupy a topos, I occupy a topos. It can be, my topos can be Hindu, it can be communist, it can be liberal, it can be conservative, it can be dharmic, it can be Islamic, whatever my topos is, and yours can be something else. It can be Jain, it can be Cārvāka, whatever, Hindutva. But the starting point of the dialogue is I have something to learn from you because I'm incomplete. I don't have perfect knowledge. Now, those who are very steeped in their methodology, whether they are Islamists or radicals or communists or secular fundamentalists, they will never admit the incompleteness of their position. So it's impossible to have a dialogue with them. So, in that sense, diatopical hermeneutics is not for them. It's only, I would say, ideological clashes. When I say these ignorant armies clashing by night, to quote Matthew Arnold, that's what they bring everything down to, which we see the noise on our mainstream media at 9 o'clock, or the obsessive and excessive slamming of opponents on social media. So I move away a little bit from diatopical to intermediality, because intermediality is not just about two topoi. It's not just that there are polarities and you steer in between. Intermediality can deal with many positions, basically, and is a productive way of reading Tagore, reading Gandhi, reading Savarkar, reading Hedgewar. I mean, of contrasting Hindutva nationalism with maybe Gandhian nationalism. Intermediality allows us to face off these positions in a meaningful way and not in a reductive and polarizing and ideological way.
I get it, but what is fascinating in this entire process is what basically we are talking about is how does the churn happen in a society? How do we do a samvad? And what I've noticed is, I agree with you. The thing is that social media is designed in a very absurd sort of way. Social media or discourse is designed where only the ideologue gets to speak and gets a seat at the table, and the ideologue by nature, that's how the ideologue the essence of an ideologue is that I will not compromise, because they're an ideologue. They are attached to an idea, they're too married to an idea. And as you were talking about hermeneutics, actually, to take us, using Indian epistemology, I was immediately reminded of Anekantvad of Mahavira. How Anekantvad creates a very flexible and pluralistic system of dialogue. Now, obviously, Mahavira's Anekantvad was about finding the truth. But if you were to use and extrapolate the principles of Anekantvad, and if you could, take those principles and put the Saptabhangi Naya in a a process where we are conversing with each other, I think it would create a very, very interesting sort of scenario where, as you rightfully said, nobody knows everything with certainty. And when you don't know something with certainty, and if you come with that position on the table where you genuinely are intellectually humble, the biggest lack of humility that I see in an ideologue is epistemic humility. People are not epistemically humble, right? I mean, if you're not epistemically humble, you've lost the battle there, because you're not going to learn. And now I want to connect it to something that you write in this book, to talk about what does it mean to be a liberal today, Dr. Paranjape, right? I mean, is liberalism dying, or is liberalism now morphing into something unworkable? Now, I don't know. I thought I was a liberal until I met some liberals. I did not. I mean, I can't relate to those people. I mean, they are so fixated in their worldviews that I don't know what to do with them. So let's talk about liberalism and how, through this book itself, you talk about the journey of your interaction with liberals inside JNU, and how they were not so liberal with you.
Right. So I think your question about liberalism can be answered vis-a-vis the claims that liberals make, similar to the claims that secularists make. So liberalism by itself is not at fault. It's just that the liberals have let it down by being hypocrites, by selective and deeply propagandist or deeply uh, dishonest political posturing. So it's not liberalism that has failed. Of course, there's a deep contradiction in liberalism because, on the one hand, economic liberals are about laissez faire economics, about the free market, and about individual freedoms, which most of us support. But social liberals are so obsessed with equalizing and tokenism and identity politics that liberalism is kind of splitting down the middle. It's schizophrenic, it's Janus faced. It's facing in two opposite directions, and so its internal contradictions are bringing it down. But I think, apart from that, it's really the liberals who have let down liberalism, and it's not new. 100 years ago, people in the Western world were spying for Russia, for Mother Russia, in the name of liberalism, and today they're doing it, for some other powers and for some other causes which are very divisive and very bad for their own country. And this is happening in America, it's happening in Britain, it's happening in India. And one of the sorry, should I say, sordid and sorry records of liberalism is its inability to call out radical Islamism, which is a threat to the world. And instead, they focus on other things, blaming the victim and so forth. So my book has all of these things. But for me, JNU is the theater of these debates. And those who claim to be tolerant, those who claim to be progressive, those who claim to be dissenters, those who claim to be, fighting for the rights of the underdog. I found all of these people were highly suspect. Highly, I would say, lacking in integrity. So again, as I said, the book is a means to use JNU, which became a theater of an anti-government and more particularly anti-BJP, anti-Modi campaign. And for me, that is not the purpose of a university, okay? You can do your politics, you can have opinions, you can stage a dharna, but you can't shut down the university because of the claim that an elected government and an elected prime minister is not legitimate just because you disagree with their ideology. So I found that this was really insidious, it was nefarious. And when they started promoting the Kashmiri separatists, which, by the way, they're done earlier, but the flashpoint came this time because there was another group of students who opposed them. And then they turned it into this, as I said, this international theater where, the university was closed, classes were suspended, which is very undemocratic. Because if I want to study, how can you stop me? And that's how the Karamchari Union, which nobody talks about, I've talked about it in my book, did not support the students or the teachers. The Teachers Association and the students came together because they were associated both with the same Communist Party, CPIM. And the Karamchari Union said, nothing doing. Our children want to study, and you are preventing them from going to labs and classrooms. So the position I took in the teach-in was that a university cannot be subverted from its primary purpose, which is learning, teaching, and essentially getting degrees for students. It can't be shut down and turned into this platform against a particular government just because you don't agree with the ideology of the government. Okay.
But what is interesting in this entire process, Dr. Paranjape, is that um, while you were standing for a principle that actually any decent human being should stand for, to be very honest, I mean, अभी अगर यूनिवर्सिटी में बच्चा पढ़ाई नहीं करेगा तो और क्या करेगा, मुझे तो आज तक ये नहीं समझ पड़ा. So but the point is that there's a very interesting line in the book that you mentioned. You say that when it came to, you being heckled, and heckled is the right word, because you were being heckled. I still remember the that image of, कहाँ था आप, वो डिबेट कर रहे थे, यू वर कॉल्ड फॉर अ डिस्कशन और अ डिबेट, वैसे स्टूडेंट्स थे और आप खड़े थे और शायद कन्हैया था, पता नहीं, मुझे याद नहीं एग्जैक्टली क्या था. वो इमेज मेरे दिमाग में आज भी बैठी हुई है. मुझे याद है मैंने टीवी पे देखा था. But it's a very interesting thing. In the book, you write, I think it's again in the prologue, you say, paradoxically, while the official right wing in JNU did little to help me or endorse what I stood for, I had overwhelming encouragement and sustenance from well meaning Indians, not just in India but also abroad. I'm not a member of any political party or outfit. That is why I'm thankful for the unselfish affinity and fellowship of those who have defended and protected me. Now, why am I asking this? Is there's a specific reason. Professor Paranjape, there's a lot of talk of nationalism in India. एक तरफ एक एक इस्लामिस्ट आइडियोलॉजी है, और एक तरफ, आई डोंट नो, मेरे को तो डर नहीं लगता, मैं तो सीधा कह देता हूँ, मुझे तो कभी भी ऐसा शर्म नहीं आई. ये जो नेशनलिज्म की परिभाषा क्या है डॉक्टर परांजपे? व्हाट इज अ नेशनलिज्म? ये हो रहा क्या है हमारे देश में? एक, वेयर डू वी नो नेशनलिज्म बिकम्स जिंगोइज्म इज माय प्रॉब्लम. And let us talk about something that you share in your book. You talk in detail about Rabindranath Tagore. You spend a lot of time on that, and the excerpts you share there, I request you to talk about that now.
See, Tagore has been considered an anti-nationalist by many who want to use him against nationalism. Okay, why do they want to use him against nationalism? Because they think nationalism equals BJP, and what they stand for, is against the BJP. But I have argued in the book that in the lectures on nationalism that Tagore gave, he gave them in Japan in 1917, and then he gave them in the US. That was the time of the First World War. And he was alarmed at exactly what you said, the jingoism, the chauvinism, and basically how nationalism became imperialism. Now, he couldn't use the word imperialism or colonialism because he was tailed by the British Secret Service, especially on his journeys to the East. So, many people used to use code words. Like, I would say that the subaltern word, which has become so common, was used by Gramsci as a code word because he couldn't use the proletariat, or for example, Mikhail Bakhtin, he used polyphony as a code word because he couldn't, say that socialist realism sucked. So people use code words if we are not free to say what we want to say. And I think Tagore was not free to say that he hated, imperialism. He hated one country colonizing the other and completely dominating that other country and sucking its lifeblood. So he called it nationalism with an N. And it's interesting that these lectures, which were in English, when they're translated back into Bengali, they don't say Rashtra, they don't say Desh, they don't say Samaj in Bangla. They use the word nation because Tagore uses it in a very special sense. But let's face it, Tagore was deeply concerned at the mechanistic and humanistic way in which ideologies brainwash individuals, instrumentalize them, use them for a purpose which is eventually very bad for them as human beings. It's against human flourishing to instrumentalize another human being. And ideologies do that. Communism does it, and a certain kind of nationalism also does it. And we're seeing it today. You have these foot soldiers who are so proud of being nationalist, and they can be very violent. They can be very intolerant of others who disagree with them. But I think when we come to nationalism in India, we must recognize that there were competing kinds of nationalism, competing brands of models of nationalism when India tried to become free. And one, as you rightly said, was a kind of Islamist nationalism, which eventually became Pakistan. It was the ideologues were people like Maulana Maududi, not Iqbal, but who Maududi, he wanted to create a Sharia compliant modern state of, so to speak, pure Muslims, you know. So these were revivalist movements deeply influenced by Wahhabism. And I think the consequences are disastrous the world over, wherever people go to that. So India chose secularism, and Gandhi and Nehru believed that your religion is your personal affair. The citizen has a contract with the state and with the leaders he or she elects. And Ambedkar wrote a constitution which reflects some of these principles. But unfortunately, the politics of post independence India did not honor this secularism of our constitution. Instead, they played ducks and drakes with it, you know, which we call today pseudo secularism, appeasement of minorities, using state funds to send people to Hajj. What has a pilgrimage, which is a requirement of a particular religion, to do with the taxpayer and his or her money? It's absolutely unacceptable to use our money. But you want to appease them, create vote banks. But we've done it across the board. It's not just with religion. We've played identity politics with region, with language, with caste, with ethnicity, with tribal, non tribal, you name it. We've played all these games, and all of them to me go against the spirit of the Constitution, where we are supposed to be equal in the eyes of the state and the law, which we are not. We have different personal laws, etc., etc. So I think that model also failed. And then there was NDA under Vajpayee. I would call it Hindutva 1.0. And that didn't work either, because they did not come up with a robust alternative to the pseudo secular model. And now you have a very muscular Hindutva, which is being championed by all and sundry without being properly debated. And the danger of that is that you want to create a de facto Hindu state while you have a de jure secular state. And I think that's underhand. We shouldn't do that. If you want a Hindu state, declare it openly, make it a part of your election manifesto. Go to the people, win an election, modify the constitution. See, I think one of the big failings of us in India is this hypocrisy. The hypocrisy of liberals is, of course, reprehensible, but the hypocrisy of the Hindutva should not be, raised to some summit of virtue either. So you can't say on the one hand that, oh, the Muslims of India have the same DNA as Hindus, and then say you must distrust every Muslim because their religion is, whatever you want to call it, illogical or stuck in time or too fanatical, because that's simply not true historically. There are all kinds of Muslims, all kinds of Muslim states, and all Muslims are not the same, even in India. And even, the North faced a kind of Islamic invasion, and the South didn't face most of it, though there was a sultanate in Madurai for a brief time. There were traders in the South, and you'll see where Islam is not linked to the quest for power and domination. It's a different Islam. Okay, if you go to Tamil Nadu, most of the business community is Muslim, even in Sri Lanka, in certain parts, apart from Chettiars and other communities, and they're not necessarily always at war. Of course, the danger is they can be radicalized. And does it mean that Hindus cannot be radicalized? They can also be radicalized. So, to answer your question, I think that the pendulum is swinging to the other side, and maybe it's a corrective, but it shouldn't go too far in the other direction. That's why, as I've said today in my op ed, that the alternative or the substitute for appeasement is not domination, where you create a state where anybody who doesn't subscribe to your religion or ideology becomes a second class or a second rate citizen. What do I mean by second class? I mean by second class that the law treats them differently. That won't happen. And all government schemes, as this government is very proud of saying over and over again, does not differentiate between a person's religion. It doesn't, but it does, because there are some schemes which are still only for minorities, which this government itself has promoted. So let's face that, and they're still funding madrasas and other things, which I don't think they should do. No religious school should be funded by the state. Anyhow, but so it can't be de jure right now. That would be second class citizen. That's not possible right now. But second rate citizens, yes, that can easily happen if you constantly demonize a particular community, and it's already happening. I have people who complain that we don't get a house in the society if you're Muslim, and we are discriminated against. And you can't brush aside all this. And nor can you justify it just because somebody beheaded someone else. You see, these are two completely different things, and we must have a way of differentiating them. So that's why I say zero tolerance for hatred, bigotry, religious violence, zero tolerance for places of worship being used for other purposes. And let's not forget that some of this also happened in Punjab with another faith. And even today, there have been so-called blasphemy killings, even in the holiest shrines of other faiths, than Muslims. So the point is, why are we ignoring those, danger signs as well? So my point is that intermediate hermeneutics means that if you're opposed to appeasement, it doesn't mean that you should look the other way when you're demonizing another community, stereotyping them. On the other hand, we should isolate the bad elements and build bridges with the good ones so that you have social harmony. Because let me say to you, Kushalji, I don't see India becoming a great country or progressing economically if you have second-rate citizens, because there will be so much simmering discontent. People feel insulted, they feel terribly hurt, and they will harbor the enemies of the state, as we know has happened in Kashmir. Neighbors telling neighbors, it's happened elsewhere, even in Udaipur. So please, we must create conditions of social amity and harmony, and that can only be done if the state is a fair arbiter, not that you're playing, the Yadav card somewhere and the Jat card somewhere else and the Maratha card, in the state that you live in, and a Muslim card here, a Hindu card there. I'm sorry, we are not going to be a great country. We won't be a great nation, and we won't certainly have an Indian or a Hindu renaissance if we continue this double speak and hypocrisy, because it will create tremendous distrust between the ruled and the rulers, and that distrust will then translate into a weakened social fabric, more inequality, which will lead to violence. Let's face it.
You know what I always sit and worry about as far as India is concerned is this: India has a weird sort of a scenario. The failure of the Indian secular order, or the Indian secularists, has created a very justified anger in the Hindu community, because all roads lead to Hinduism being bad. But I completely am in agreement with you. This is the classic Popperian paradox, right? How much do you tolerate the intolerant? Is the classical paradox, and the debate is not whether you tolerate the intolerant. The debate is whether how intolerant is the intolerant itself, right? How do we grade the intolerance of the intolerant, and how should the response then be calibrated to the intolerant? And that's where I always tell my friends that in fighting Islamism we cannot become an Islamist. Otherwise, फिर मतलब क्या रह गया? नहीं तो फिर मैं भी कन्वर्ट हो जाता हूँ ना. अगर मेरे को मेरा तरीका प्रेजेंट करना है, if I want to present myself as a dharmic person, as a Hindu, and I genuinely believe my way is better. I don't even hide it. I genuinely believe my way is better. If my way is better, why am I copying something that, if in my perceived idea, is inferior, right? Now people can think they Islamism is superior, and I've got no issues with that. They can live their way. I'm not here to do that. But my point is, if I believe something that I believe in genuinely, let's say I believed in liberal principles, I thought liberalism was better, so I should own up to those principles, and I'm with you on that. But then how do we deal with this intolerant streak then in that case? I mean, the Indian state, Dr. Paranjpe, has failed us. The Indian state has failed us when Kanhaiya Lal gets beheaded, right? It's a failure of the Indian state that, you know like I say, did I find the way Nupur said things on national television palatable? No, I did not. But the point is, the state should protect. Kanhaiya Lal was just murdered for saying, I support Nupur Sharma's right to be a blasphemer. That's all he did, right? And he got beheaded for
No, no,
that.
1 second. There's no such thing as blasphemy. I'm so sorry, in the Indian Constitution and those
Uh-huh.
articles 295A and so forth. I wrote another piece on this. I said that the Supreme Court should issue guidelines to police stations that before they file an FIR under those articles of the Indian Penal Code, those sections, they should ensure that there's a case prima facie. But listen, my point is the state should make its view absolutely clear that there'll be zero intolerance of religious hatred mongering from any community. It's not that there'll be a differential treatment. When you're promoting violence in the name of a religion, that's not on. Now, it's not that you will say that, as I keep saying, that we had a situation where people were saying that Islamic fanaticism or Sikh fanaticism is not as dangerous as Hindu fanaticism. So we look the other way when it comes to minority fanaticism or minority religious extremism. But when it comes to even a whiff of Hindutva, a kind of aggressive, or self-defense, whatever mode, then you demonize it. So that's
Mhm.
absolutely rubbish. But now you can't take the opposite position, which is that we'll be very tolerant of Hindutva aggression because we've been suppressed for so long. It's all right to let out steam. No, I don't think so.
I
Whether
agree.
whether it's cow vigilantism or I'll tell you, the other day there was a debate about a Bajrang Dal helpline. This just proves what you said, that the state has failed.
Yes,
So am I in favor of this helpline? I am, because if the state fails, where will I go? But the helpline
absolutely.
shows that the state's failure is so palpable. But I'm saying the state can succeed tomorrow. It can if you're an honest broker, you're an
Hmm.
honest power broker, and you put out that we treat everybody equally. That's what I'm constantly saying. This is a part of the modernization process of citizenship and citizenship training. That I elect somebody because he's not someone of my biradari. And this is what Modi has been doing. He has been showing over and over again, even in Azamgarh, that beyond identity politics, there is the politics of good governance. So I'm all for that. And I can even accept Hindu consolidation as a political strategy. Why not? Because when you're dividing in the name of religion, as others have done, if you consolidate in the name of religion, why should you not consolidate Hindu votes when you're consolidating Muslim votes in Bengal or Assam or wherever? But I think at the level of civil society, and as you know, I mean, these organizations permeate all sections of society. That's where you can't constantly ratchet up a hatred and aggression because you think there'll be political, dividends down the road. That's what I'm trying to say. That's why, as an intellectual, the commentariat, whatever the intelligentsia, we should not look the other way. We should, I would say, that call out some of these tendencies and trends. Though I still feel, as you said, that that's where Anekanand, Syadvad or is a little different from saying, listen to this. Sanatan Dharma has fantastic things to offer. I think that, that's a good way to go. But that doesn't mean that, everybody should become a Kshatriya, everybody's fighting for Dharma. Who's authorized them, who has made these dharmic warriors and, the Ugra Hanumans, and somehow it seems as if it's very virtuous. Now, so I say that for you got beaten down when all these invaders came, what happened to your anger then? Don't tell me that all of this is just riding piggyback on the success of BJP, right? Under UPA also, where were you? Where were all these people at that time? Many, in fact, were very much on the other side. I could name names. I don't want to do that. So I'm against, in other words, this hypocrisy, this double standard. And in my book, I said, the shades of color between red and saffron are so, few that, one of the mistakes that these current regime people made is they took all these converted reds and they said, inko banao, because they've joined our side, The neophyte is more welcome. And unfortunately, they made mistakes because they haven't been able to handle institutions properly. There's a decline in higher education. And I keep saying that ideology cannot be our only justification. And if the left was anti-intellectual in some way, so are you, because you don't respect people who know or who have expertise in their particular area. You are more interested also in promoting people of your own ideology, and and the argument is, oh, they did it, so we'll do it. That doesn't convince me. That doesn't make you a great country. If you have competence phobia along with competence deficit, that doesn't make you a great country.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you. Now, I kept this quote for the end because I think this is a very important quote from the book. You say, shouldn't we ask instead whether we are dharmic or adharmic rather than liberal or illiberal? Or to shift to a Persianized idiom, are we imandar or be-iman? Our problem then is not lack of ideology, but of integrity. Our failing is not illiberalism, but hypocrisy. I think what we've been talking about, Dr. Paranjape, in its own way, is that we are all part of a society where the human beings are tribal by nature. Human beings tend to be, human beings go in groups. I know, I mean, and then we have this habit of ignoring the follies of our own side while looking at the folly of the other. I mean, and every time we do it, the excuse is that अरे वो करता है तो मैं क्यों नहीं कर सकता. It's always, that's the only answer I get on social media. Somebody, I'll use the example of free speech in India, is because that is something that is very dear to me. Poor Ketaki Chitle. Now again, that WhatsApp forward must have been disgusting, and I agree. Ketaki Chitle did not deserve to go to jail. She was jailed for criticizing a politician. But there will be a so-called right wing that will only talk about Ketaki Chitle. I can point out cases where people are jailed for criticizing BJP leaders too in India. If you were not a hypocrite and you stood up for first principles and you really believed in democracy, human rights, and building India to be a robust economy and a nation, you would have a problem in both cases. But this is so typical of our discourse that some people have a problem for Ketaki Chitle, others have a problem for the other case. Nobody has a problem for the principle. And I think your quote in the book that I just read from my cell phone, I think that hits at the nuts of our problem. I don't know, maybe if you have a slightly different view on this.
No, I completely agree. I completely agree. And I think that if someone were to ask me, what is Sanatan Dharma in a nutshell, I would say Satyameva Jayate. Na Anratam. Anratam means adharma. Sanatan Dharma says that adharma can never win in the long run. And Satyameva Jayate also in the long run. And people are very impatient and they'll say, in the short run, what happens? We'll lie, we'll cheat, we'll kill, and we'll win. No, no. And the only thing that I'm trying to say, though, is that if you agree that truth is the highest principle, then the question is, how do you arrive at it? Is it anekantavad, as you said, or is it intermediate hermeneutics? That's your choice. But it's certainly not ideology. Ideology means I have the truth, I possess, knowledge because either God told me, or it's in my book, or my system is perfect. I'm a dialectical materialist and my system is scientific and yours is not. Yours is based on superstition. So my book is trying to say that these methods of either arriving at truths or even proving them or establishing them or promoting them don't work. What works is a continuous and perennial engagement with the nature of truth, which is exactly what science is interested in, and it falsifies those beliefs, those ideas which no longer hold. I think that social studies, humanities should also do the same. We should also cleave to truth and discard those things which don't work. And I agree with your idea of tribalism, except I feel that there's one human tribe in the end. Call it Homo sapiens, and there's one human civilization. And the fundamental principle of human civilization is that the best practices are copied. So if you think Sanatan Dharma is the best and can be the basis of a fantastic society and even of a great nation, of a great government, then you should create, a society where human flourishing is possible. Human flourishing cannot be possible when you're constantly demonizing someone, dominating someone, hoisting your flag and trampling on other people. And for me, that's not Swaraj. Swaraj definitely means opposing the one who oppresses you. But Swaraj also means self restraint when you have more power than the other, so that you don't ground them down into the dust. And we are Swarajists, that is our polity. We are Sanatanis, we follow Satya. That is our, you might say, our metaphysics, our axiology, because Sat means, that which is, that's metaphysics, that's ontology. And Satya or Satkaryavad, or whatever, these are axiological meaning, that mode of conduct, Sadachar, Gandhiji called it, and then he made it Satyagraha. So Satyagraha, Sadachar, all of these, the Purusharthas, are those modes of conduct, behavior, social arrangement, thinking, achar, vichar, whatever you want to call them, which are conducive to that way of life. And for that, you don't need a belief in a god or a book or a prophet, and it can be, descent, avatarhood, or it can be ascent, like in the Jains and the Buddhists, where the human being makes themselves so capable that the gods say, wow, well done. So both these paths are given to us. And I think if our civilization is great and we are true to it, then all we need to do is to revive and practice those, I would say, those eternal principles, which is what Sanatan means. Eternal, they're still valid. But they're not valid and eternal in the sense it was laid down in a book and it's unchanging. On the contrary, it's completely dynamic. But it can only be realized in practice. It's not a theory, it's not an ideology, but it's an orthopraxy, as I said in an earlier conversation with you. It's
Absolutely.
not, it's not an orthodoxy, it's an orthopraxy.
Yep. So just before we wrap up, Dr. Paranjape, a lot of there's a huge chunk of the audience of this podcast that is between the age group of 18 to 25, and then 25 to say 35 onwards. This is probably the largest chunk. Maybe 65% of the viewership is going to be that. So my last question to you before we wrap up for today is going to be, how and why should a young kid listen to these words that come out of your mouth? How do they absorb them, and how do they maybe use them in real life then?
See, this is such an important question, Kushalji, and I'm so glad you raised it. One of the values that India stood for is also freedom. But for us, freedom was mostly spiritual, because it encompassed the differentiation and multiplicity of aspirations and paths to the ultimate reality. But today we need social freedom, we need political freedom. And therefore, I think that for the young, I would say that a precondition for human flourishing is freedom. So you should be free to question, free to disagree, and also free to resist the cancel culture, free to resist wokeism, because you're too polite today. You don't want to offend anybody. But remember, anything you say or do may be construed as offensive by somebody. So don't be afraid. Follow your own métier, follow your own inner calling, and don't be afraid. And freedom is required for human flourishing. And freedom is freedom to disagree with your elders, with your teachers, with each other. And I would always say to a young person, ask yourself, what is the good life? And of course, for you, it would include some degree of material independence and prosperity, which I would never undervalue. Stand on your own feet. That is the foundation of Swaraj. And stand on your own feet economically, but also intellectually, also emotionally. And I think that when I said Satyameva Jayate, the other side of Satya is, of course, freedom. Call it Swaraj or call it Azadi or call it Swatantra, which is, of course, a technical word in Kashmir Shaivism because only Shiva is Swatantra. And we are Shiva, of course, in that sense. So it's the consciousness revolution that is going to help our world and not ideology. And I think that the world that we live in is very complex, and no one discipline, no one country, no one, no one person, no one guru, no one teacher, no one tradition, no one religion, etc., has all the answers. So I would say keep your minds open, and certainly don't believe what I say. Okay, absolutely not. But check it out for yourself.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with you and endorse these views that uh, you should always have an open mind. You should listen to people, go and check them out, and then make up your mind. So, guys, I guess we'll wrap today's discussion up. But before we wrap it up, I once again want to thank Dr. Paranjape for coming on the podcast, sir. It's as always a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much. And I hope some of you feel impelled to read the book and that it does open up some windows or doors in your mind. Thank you so much.
All right, guys, we'll wrap today's discussion up. But in the description of the podcast, whether you're watching this on YouTube or you're listening to this on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever, you'll see a link in the description of the podcast to buy the book. You can go there and buy the book. I insist everybody goes and buys this book. It's a very, very, very good and important read to as. And I think Dr. Paranjape was in the middle of the storm in JNU, and it kind of he kind of his journey is also a journey of the discourse of India. So it's a fascinating read. I insist all of you please go and buy the book. Also follow Dr. Paranjape on Twitter. I'll leave the Twitter handle over there. As far as I'm concerned, you guys know the drill. You can subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave your comments underneath this video, or you can support me on Patreon or on YouTube or through the merch and through UPI. I'll see you guys next time. Until then, take care. Goodbye.